According to studies conducted by researchers at the World Economic Forum, the cost of extreme weather damages from 2000 to 2019 averaged around $143 billion, which breaks down to 16.3 million per hour. Over the past 20 years, extreme weather events have cost an estimated $2.8 trillion in total. Another study, backed by the government of Germany, states that damages from climate change will set the world economy back by an estimated $38 trillion a year by 2049. This figure could go up to $59 trillion if emissions and other pollutants are not kept in check and the impacts of climate change begin to become exponentially severe. This includes the cost of damages to infrastructure, property, agriculture, and human health. At an estimated $6 trillion, that is $6 trillion per year, the cost of measures to limit global warming to within 2 degrees Celsius of pre-industrial temperatures by 2050 would be less than a sixth of the cost of the estimated damage caused by allowing warming to exceed that level, that is 2 degrees. If emissions continue at today's rate and the average global temperature climbs to 4 degrees centigrade and beyond, the estimated economic toll after 2050 would amount to a mammoth 60% income loss by the turn of the century. Limiting the temperatures to 2 degrees would contain those losses to an average of 20%. Who's going to foot the $6 trillion bill? The world has agreed to $300 billion per year as of now. There is a fundamental inequality over who is impacted most by climate change and who has benefited most from the polluting practices responsible for the present climate crisis. These are the nations who also have more resources of mitigating future damages. This argument has become one of the most difficult political sticking points when it comes to negotiating global action to reduce emissions. Less affluent nations bearing the brunt of climate change argue that wealthy nations like the US and Western Europe have already reaped the benefits from fossil fuel and therefore should pay more to cover the losses and damages poor countries are now facing. The richer nations have also the wherewithal to help the global south with the costs of adapting to greener sources of energy. News9, in collaboration with TERI, has put together this feature that explores the extent of the problem the world may be looking at as a result of the looming climate shift. Climate change has resulted in intense drought, water scarcity, severe fires, rising sea levels, flooding, melting polar ice, catastrophic storms and earthquakes. Myanmar and Thailand being the latest victims of nature's wrath and declining biodiversity.
If we go ahead consuming as we're doing right now, there is no future for humanity.
Climate change and also related to what is the energy transition is amongst the top 2, if not the top problem for the world to solve today.
Many of the targets we have taken in the SDGs or the development goals, we're not going to achieve them. We have a target of 1.5, we're most likely not going to achieve it. We have to transform it, we have to change, that is quite obvious. Because at the end of the day, climate change is costing us much, much more than the gains of short-term profit ideas or egoistic lifestyle.
Imagine with 1.55 degrees increase in temperature, what is happening in India. You talk of glaciers meltdown, you talk of very high temperature in Delhi, you talk of air pollution in cities like Mumbai. So somewhere we have to act very fast, and thus this conference becomes important.
Rich countries have comprehensively failed to put anything close to that on the table. So that $300 billion that you mentioned is woefully inadequate even to cover the current loss and damage that developing countries are facing because of the historic emissions of the rich world.
I think there's going to be some more difficult negotiations for sure. Without the United States at the table, perhaps negotiations will go a little more smoothly.
Financial flows from developed to developing countries are below where they need to be. That's absolutely the case.
Picture this. Between the years 1993 and 2022, more than 765,000 lives were lost. The direct economic losses amounted to $4.2 trillion adjusted for inflation. All of this driven by more than 9,400 extreme weather events, and the frequency and intensity of climate-related disasters continues to rise. So does the world's need for more energy, more plastic, more trade, more consumption of all sorts of goods, fancy and otherwise. The choice has been made, hasn't it? As the French would say, tout le voulez, or fait tout le demander. You wanted it, in fact, you asked for it. Who does the climate shift really affect? 7 of the 10 most affected countries in 2022 belong to the high-income group. This clearly indicates that while the coping capacities of high-income countries significantly exceeds those of lower-income ones, they are also at a higher climate risk. America ranks amongst the most affected countries due to the effects of climate change, along with Nigeria, Italy, Spain, Greece, Portugal, and Pakistan. It is also amongst the biggest emitters of greenhouse gases per capita. The effects of climate shift would not care to distinguish between the global north and the global south, but the global south would suffer from acute scarcity when it comes to the wherewithal of dealing with climate change.
I think it's easy to be discouraged right now about the possibility for meaningful climate action. This is a make or break moment for the planet. We are about to crash through the 1.5 degree safety rails that will keep the planet livable, and we are heading very fast for 3 degrees, which would render many parts of the Earth, including India, simply unlivable.
If we see the UNEP report, the latest one, they say with the current trend and policies being implemented, we are in for a 3.1 degree increase by the turn of the century. Even if all the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, are implemented, the report tells us we will still have 2.6. Whereas we were aspiring for 1.5. So, in my view, actually climate change is very dangerous because it's like creeping upon us gradually. So while it gives us an opportunity to adapt, but it also leads to a tipping point beyond which we may not be able to reverse.
Imagine with 1.55 degrees increase in temperature, what is happening in India. You talk of glaciers melt down, you talk of very high temperature in Delhi, you talk of air pollution in cities like Mumbai. So somewhere we have to act very fast, and thus this conference becomes important.
Even if you look at it, you call 1.5 to well beyond 2, the directional issue is that we need to address this big issue of climate change. Now, in the way that we look at it, we should also look at it from a context of where we are standing as a country as well. So some of that will be solutions that everybody will look at it. Some would be what Global South is looking at it, and some absolutely what India is looking at it. Now, in a lot of ways, the energy transition, in my view, the policy framework, to a large extent is already in front of us. So government has been quite progressive. The transition of what is happening around us on making the entire energy availability green, it is already there. A lot of the institutional support is being built up, right from all the value chain is being created. We as corporates coming together from a private sector involvement point of view, all of us are in that spectrum, and we are playing our own parts. But having said that, one can argue whether the pace is enough. So the question is, directionally we are there. How quickly we are going to address this issue is a question that we all need to have.
Years ago, the Western nations, they colonized this global South, and they exploited nature, and they started actually to plant monocultures, cut the local forests, and started also in a way with climate change already 500 years ago. Now, when climate change really happening and we're really facing the music and we see all the damage which is happening around the world, somehow the West is saying, okay, it was not our fault, and let's see, and they're playing for time. Of course, it is a very bad situation because the global South is actually really not responsible for all the emissions which are causing climate change. So it is, in spiritual terms, also a karmical story which is unfolding right now. And from a spiritual viewpoint, we have to deal with love and compassion, and we have to bring self-transformation, and we have to inspire our neighbors, our friends, our family to bring also transformation on the inside and build up inner strength and inner resilience to face the transformation the planet is undergoing right now.
At the last UN Climate Change Conference COP29 in Baku, Azerbaijan in November 2024, wealthy nations agreed for the first time in 15 years to increase the amount of money they would provide for climate mitigation and adaptation in developing nations. The new target, $300 billion annually by 2035, is way better than the previous goal of $100 billion that concluded in the year 2020. But it is still a far cry from what's needed. The leaders of all nations also agreed to work together to mobilize $1.3 trillion by the year 2035 for countries most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change.
Those who are suffering from climate change, the impact of climate change, unfortunately, is more on the countries who are not contributors. It's also now very clear that those who are responsible for it are not willing to put money into it. So it becomes important for us to recognize that we have to work, we have to take action, and it can only be possible through partnerships. So in this particular conference, which is held annually, we call experts, policymakers from various parts of the country and let them debate. They should also know what the expectations of Global South are. They should also know what is the mood of people over there, and also understand where the research in these countries is.
The two things that would need to happen there are investment in grid infrastructure to allow the renewables to be absorbed. Most renewable energy is grid connected, it's not off grid. The other thing to happen is that in many countries, least developed countries, they have low credit ratings. It costs a lot of money to borrow. It costs a lot to borrow the money you would need to invest. So there needs to be things like concessional loans, etc., that will help to reduce the cost of capital for the private sector and allow the finance to flow. I think we understand these things. It's a question of how to get on with it, and it will need the financial flows from developed to developing countries are below where they need to be. That's absolutely the case. Not just for reducing emissions, but for helping countries adapt to climate change or to address issues around loss and damage, which is now a big part of the Paris Agreement.
The rich countries have comprehensively failed to put anything close to that on the table. So that $300 billion that you mentioned is woefully inadequate, even to cover the current loss and damage that developing countries are facing because of the historic emissions of the rich world. I think that we do see political will from some countries to close that gap, but much more is going to be needed, and therefore it's really important that India and other countries in the Global South maintain a united front on that issue of financing. We saw that working around the Loss and Damage Fund, which is something that rich countries resisted for many, many years, but thanks to a very united position from the G77 countries, it was finally adopted. And we're going to need to keep up that pressure heading into the next COP with a lot of political turbulence and uncertainty in the world.
The question is, where would $1.3 trillion come from when even $300 billion seems a stretch?
Are the funds sufficient to achieve? Again, no. And we've seen this not only now, but historically also. We've been talking about 100 billion per year from 2020 onwards. We haven't even reached that. So let's not talk about the trillions that are being discussed right now.
I think the result of those negotiations was the floor of where the developed world needs to go in terms of its contributions. Nowhere near what India and many other countries in the Global South were calling for, that $1 trillion. But as a floor, saying this is the minimum we should be providing, it's a good place to start. And then the fact that the text included that $1.3 trillion signal that this is where we need to go is a great indication of where we need to go. And it's not where we can, maybe, kinda, should go, it's where we need to go, where the world needs to be if we're gonna have any chance of avoiding the worst impacts of climate change.
African countries and some South Asian countries are staggering under a huge burden of debt, which means all of what they might spend on climate action is being eaten up by debt service. And their costs of borrowing to build, for example, new renewable energy are 5 times higher than they would be in an advanced economy.
In January this year, Washington cancelled $4 billion of pledges to Green Climate Fund, the largest of its kind globally. The fate of billions of dollars pledged by the US to green shifts in Indonesia and Vietnam remains unclear. If that were not enough, on the very first day of taking office for a second term, Donald Trump declared a national energy emergency, authorizing the expansion of domestic fossil fuel exploration and extraction, while directing federal agencies to streamline regulatory processes and accelerate energy infrastructure projects. He wasted no time reversing the green initiatives of former President Joe Biden. He withdrew the US from Paris Climate Agreement for a second time, rolled back environmental regulations, and froze green energy funding. How about that?
I think all of the steps that we're seeing the United States take right now are grave mistakes. They're creating huge roadblocks internationally. They're also going to have huge impacts in the United States as well, and that is something that the administration is just not recognizing. The energy emergency that was declared is not an energy emergency. There is no emergency. The United States is already the world's largest exporter of LNG. We already produce tons of oil. The gas prices in the United States are low. There is no energy emergency. It was created so that the administration could push its fossil fuel agenda. In terms of climate finance, the United States pulling out of all of its commitments on climate finance is a disaster for the United States. We are losing trust and credibility around the world. I should say we have lost the trust and credibility of other countries, allies and neighbors alike around the world. And that is possibly the worst place the United States could have gone after last year's COP, after all of the discussions around the new quantified collective goal on climate finance, which, as you said, was a very polarizing discussion and conversation.
No, we're going to have to look much harder at new and innovative sources of financing for climate action. At 350.org, we are campaigning for a global wealth tax, which is something that the Brazilian government has proposed as part of their COP30 agenda. Just taxing the 3,000 wealthiest people in the world at 2%, that would yield almost the same amount that was pledged in Baku for climate finance for developing countries. So it would effectively double the amount of climate finance that's on the table.
It's very interesting what's happening right now. Many people have the feeling that the carpet is being pulled underneath their feet, because with the shift in American policy, the global efforts are really undermined to deal with the climate change and the climate emergency. America is the biggest emitter, is one of the biggest financiers and is one of the scientific resources also to elaborate about climate change. They just pulled out their scientists out of NOAA also and out of the IGBT, so it's a very dramatic situation for the world right now. Nevertheless, we are one world. We are one family, we're one community, and we all have to understand that if we're not changing right now, going into the direction of clean energy, clean lifestyle, if we bring a shift into our mindset, if we're not doing it right now, we will basically see in the future a different planet where humans might be not living.
The US is going to be doing zero. Even under the previous administration, the Biden administration was able to provide $11.4 billion in a year. And that was a huge amount for the United States, given the political tone in the country at this time. But it is nowhere near what the US should be saying. I mean, you started off by saying the United States is no longer the largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, and that is true. But the United States is historically responsible for many more greenhouse gas emissions than others. So the US has a huge, huge debt to pay off in that respect. If we can hold out with these corporate contributions towards climate change, and not even contributions, but investments in climate action, and others stepping up for the next 4 years, hopefully, it will be enough to carry us through until the US can become a real player again.